The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight on The Agenda.
Cultural homes, they cater to the unique traditions, dietary cuisines, and general activities catered to a specific population, which is unique.
Then, later on The Agenda.
I always like to say that all of Hollywood movie history begins with Al Christie. Every Canadian that's ever gone to Hollywood has a direct line to Al Christie. He's the first guy there.
Cultural long-term care homes have provided elder care for seniors steeped in their language, cultural traditions, and diet. But recent legislation has left these homes grappling with an influx of new residents from outside those cultures, resulting in unforeseen and serious consequences. Joining us now to unpack what these changes mean for the long-term care sector, we welcome Dr. Samir Sinha, Director of Geriatrics at Sinai Health and the University Health Network. Stephen Harrison, Chair of Advantage Ontario and CEO of Tri-County Mennonite Homes. Alan Miusi, Chair of the Ehatare Retirement and Nursing Home and Chair of the Estonian Relief Committee. And Alexandra Gojeszczuk, CEO of Copernicus Lodge, which deals with the Polish community. And we are very grateful for the four of you coming in tonight to help us out with this conversation here. Stephen, I'm going to go really back to first principles here and make no assumptions that people know everything they need to know about this sector. So just tell us, long-term care homes are what, and they appeal to whom?
Long-term care homes. Long-term care homes in Ontario are funded predominantly by the province of Ontario. Advantage Ontario represents not-for-profit municipal homes, but a long-term care home is a place for seniors, and seniors is a loose definition. It's not just like the Shoppers Drug Mart definition of 55 and older, but certainly we have younger individuals who have complex or medical needs that are served there. They are a home, not a facility, but a home, and it is a place where people live for years sometimes, receiving spiritual, psychological, social, cultural, clinical care. It is a place where services are offered that are not at a level of an acute care hospital, but more along the lines of clinical care and supports that are needed for seniors, predominantly living in the community.
Dr. Sinha, follow up on that. Is that to suggest that basically everybody who lives in a long-term care home is sick?
Not necessarily sick, but have higher needs than a typical older person living in the community. So again, we think about long-term care homes as part of a continuum of care. The idea that there are people who are older living independent and healthy in the community, those who might need some more home and community support services, and then those who can no longer live independently in their own homes. And this is where a long-term care home becomes an option, where you have 24-hour medical care, 24-hour care available. You have medical care that's made available as well. But these are often people, if you want a flavor, often 90% of the folks living in these settings are living with a cognitive impairment. 66% are living with dementia, and many of them are living with multiple chronic health conditions.
So is this essentially where you go to end your life?
Not necessarily to end your life, but usually the typical length of stay in a long-term care home in Ontario today is about 18 months. So these are traditionally where people are living the last months and the last years of their lives.
Okay. Alexandra, we mentioned off the top we're going to be focusing on cultural long-term care homes here. How are they distinctive from a regular long-term care home?
Of course. So cultural homes, they cater to the unique traditions, dietary cuisines, and general activities catered to a specific population, which is unique. There is a focus of that linguistic ability to speak in your language, to receive services, and really support from individuals that are able to understand you. And that's key, because our seniors that come to Copernicus Lodge in Toronto are of Polish descent, and they're able to speak Polish and interact and feel that they are part of a community that is understood.
So English is not the first language at Copernicus?
We speak English, but the majority of our staff are able to communicate in Polish. And I do tell individuals that I speak more Polish at Copernicus Lodge than I do English. So that speaks to the community that we do serve.
What about your places? How does it work there?
Same thing. We cater to the Estonian Canadian community. We've been doing that for over 40 years now. And I think it's a really good, strong public partnership that we've had with the province for many decades, probably one of the strongest ones, because we're able to take care of Ontarians with cultural backgrounds that need specific needs. We just talked about how many dementia cases we take care of. You know, if anybody has had a relative or a loved one with dementia, which I had my uncle, it's difficult. But the one thing that they do is they revert back to their mother tongue. So to take away the tension, to help them, you know, just be more comfortable and to be more alert, going back to mother tongue is very important. And I think it's a benefit that we bring to Ontarians by being able to do that on a daily basis.
And give us a sense of the range of groups that are appealed to in this sector.
Well, Alexander and I are part of a sort of a rebel group of about 16 or 18 homes right now.
Rebel? Why are you rebels?
We're rebels in the sense that we're trying to get back our own domain from what happened pre-COVID. We seem to have had a very strong relationship with the province. We were able to place our own community members in our homes, but since COVID and a lot of the crisis cases in hospitals, that hasn't been, you know, what we've been experiencing the last 3-4 years. So it's been difficult. We all hope that we can return to that.
But the range of groups is what?
I'm going to say 50, 60, 70 even. I mean, I'll go back to something. A friend of mine in the community just sent me an article back from 1965, the month I was born, and literally, you know, 59 years back from this very month, communities came together: Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, Polish, Ukrainians, Native peoples, Francophonies went to the Parliament and asked for support to start cultural homes. This is 1965.
So this is not a new thing.
This is not a new thing.
No. Dr. Sinha, as you consider the range of different kinds of long-term care homes that are out there, the culturally focused ones, how significant a chunk of the overall system are they?
So about less than a third of our homes in Ontario are ones that are run by municipal governments, but also often ethnocultural communities, cultural communities that have come together and with time were supported by the government to build not-for-profit care homes that really cater to the needs of their communities, and really diverse communities. You know, we heard Estonian, Latvian, for example, Finnish, for example. We have multiple Finnish homes in Ontario. And this is a really important, you know, piece of the care, because about 2/3 of the homes are generally owned by for-profit organizations that generally cater to anybody, right? And of course, there are people who say, look, I'm happy to live in any sort of home that'll just meet my needs. It's convenient, that's all I want. But there is a significant group of Ontarians who, just as my colleagues were saying, especially when you're living with cognitive impairments, you're reverting back to your earliest memories, those creature comforts, those languages, those foods and that. And when you're thinking about caring for people with dementia in particular, that really becomes integral to providing good care. So it's very unique in Ontario that we created this. It's rare that we have this level of support in Canada for homes like these. But right now, as you said, that these homes are under threat.
Stephen Harrison, is there evidence that, in fact, older people will do better than they might otherwise do if they're in a culturally specific long-term care home?
Absolutely. There's ample evidence out there on the psychosocial side of the equation to demonstrate that as individuals revert back, particularly, and I can't emphasize this enough, Dr. Sinha has mentioned this, we are seeing a very rapid rise in the number of individuals with forms of dementia coming into seniors' care. Those individuals in our home, which is founded by a group of Mennonite churches just outside of Kitchener, 50 plus years ago now, those individuals are reverting back to Dutch and German from a language perspective. They are looking back to fond childhood memories of, we're a farming community, so they're looking back to how to integrate those components into their life. And for us, it's about how we bring those supports to them to create better well-being for them. You know, the last 18 to 24 months of someone's life is spent in long-term care right now, particularly with the heightened levels of crisis placement. Those are the pieces that people are looking for when families as well, but also the residents when they're coming into care. The challenges that we're facing right now, of course, is the equation is shifting. And so with changes in regulatory and legislative frameworks in Ontario, we are seeing a dramatic shift in the number of individuals who are in our home who actually hail from those original cultures.
Okay, let me pick at you. You've opened the door, and now let's go through it here. Alexandra, there is a law, a new law, that the Ontario legislature passed, I don't know, what, a year and a half ago or so, which changes things a lot. It was called Bill 7.
Yes.
And I wonder if you could give us the Coles Notes version of what Bill 7 is and how it has affected what you do.
Of course. So Bill 7 prioritizes emergency placements from the hospital to alleviate alternate level of care beds that are occupied by residents that would be better suited in long-term care. So that unfortunately prioritizes those placements over culturally appropriate ones. Over the last year, so I would say from January of this year up until present day, Copernicus Lodge has had 40 new admissions from ALC beds, 20 of which have been non-Polish.
So half of them are non-Polish.
Half of them are non-Polish.
Has that been a problem?
It has been a challenge, and particularly a challenge for the non-Polish residents coming in. They don't necessarily feel like they've integrated into the community that has been founded to serve a Polish population with a distinction of Polish programming.
Because they don't speak the language, or what?
They don't speak the language, but they also are not familiar with the tradition. So, of course, we try to integrate and provide those services, but that takes away from our day-to-day provided services to the Polish residents. And we don't have the unique funding model to support everyone to meet all of their needs. Particularly, you'd walk into the home and you'd say it feels like you're walking into Poland. Everyone is speaking their native tongue. They're reverting back to what, how Alan mentioned, they're reverting back to that native language. And oftentimes we see our residents that do not remember their loved ones, but they feel comfortable and understood. And they've raised that in terms of their experiences.
And I just want to pick up on that point because I think Alexandra's skirting around the really difficult part.
She's being diplomatic here, right?
She's being very diplomatic, which I applaud her for. But I think what a lot of people don't realize is we're not-for-profit homes.
Yeah.
So we don't have the same kind of reserves in our economic model to say, okay, well, we're going to just add, 15% to the food this month, and we'll take it off the residents who are with us. We're not-for-profit, which means our mandate's a little bit different. And we get subsidized, yes, we do get paid a lot by the government, but we also get subsidized by our communities through fundraising events. And so you can imagine that, we went into the business 40 years ago telling our communities that when you need a bed, we'll be here for you. We can't say that anymore.
No.
Just because of the same point that Alexandra brought up, we don't have domain over our admissions anymore.
Let me bring a different lens to this. And I don't know if this is happening, but you can tell me. Geopolitics. Let's say you're running a Polish long-term care home. Let's say you grew up during World War II, and let's say some of the new people who show up at your long-term care home are either German or Russian, with whom Poland has had a complicated history.
Correct.
Is that happening? And if so, what impact does it have on everybody?
It is happening, and I just had I heard from one of my families the other day that there's a Ukrainian home, and there was an admission for a crisis placement of a Russian family,
Correct.
and in this case it actually triggered a lot of the Ukrainian residents in the home.
What happened?
It's just they heard the language. They heard this person speaking Russian, for example, right? And there's no issues between this person and that person, but it was like in a home where it's all about Ukrainian culture.
Didn't they barricade themselves?
They barricaded themselves in.
They did.
wouldn't
Who
leave.
barricaded?
I think it was the Russian that barricaded
Barricaded
themselves.
And they
themselves
wouldn't
in.
allow the Ukrainian co-resident to enter into their shared room.
It was
because
a shared
basic
space they were in.
shared
Oh, I
space.
see.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's the basis. It's not about these people not liking each other, but it's again when you're just being yourself, but all of a sudden, it's just that for this person with dementia, this person not understanding the geopolitics that are existing, you can imagine, and that's why. And I have to emphasize, none of this is about queue jumping or anything like this. These are all homes that were organized with an agreement with these cultural communities.
Yes.
Do us a favor, build beds so that we need more long-term care beds. Do us a favor, we'll do it in partnership with your community. Your communities will subsidize us with this idea in place that your community will go through the process and there'll be beds for them as well.
But it's not a new issue. So my auxiliary president, who's been with the home for decades, over 40 years as a volunteer, who was part of the groundbreaking and the organizing kind of development committee of Copernicus Lodge, brought me a newsletter from the Globe and Mail circa 1998 of the impact of the new placement coordinators in terms of regulation of long-term care homes impacting this very issue we sit here today and discuss on cultural admissions and that negative impact that we're no longer going to have that unique home and the ability to maintain admissions for our communities.
Stephen, let me play devil's advocate for a second here, which is to say the reason this is happening is because the government of Ontario, in its wisdom, has decided that there are too many seniors who are not well, who are in hospitals, who are taking up valuable space in hospitals and don't need to be in hospitals and would be better served in long-term care settings. And so they are trying to get them out of hospitals into long-term care settings, even if it's not culturally appropriate. Do you understand the kind of background that has led us to where we are today?
I do, and I would say that on a very academic level, that is exactly what's happened. The challenge, and going back to 1998 and even earlier, is the placement model or the care coordination model that leads to that admission into long-term care. One of the key elements that's missing is a recognition of culturally appropriate housing or long-term care for individuals.
That this provincial government does not recognize.
It does not recognize it in the admissions process. So as you're going through a crisis placement, there are a number of elements that are brought in. You get to put forward the names of the homes you would like to go to. There are different things like that. But if they're not available to you and you are taking up one of those very valuable spaces in the hospital, you could be moved against your will, under the umbrella of Bill 7, into a home that may not be the right fit for you. And one of the pieces that is missing from the equation when they determine crisis placement is that cultural appropriateness. You hear stories of homes where 10, 15% or higher of their new admissions in the total mix of the home are no longer from that cultural group or from that social group. What it is starting to do is it is creating a dilution of the impact of the cultural home on its residents. It's creating instability. We hear stories of individuals barricading themselves in their rooms. Individual residents who've already been placed in the home are hearing language in the hallways that can be triggering. And none of it is done maliciously by the residents. It's just the process or the system and the way that it's actually moving people into care.
I guess if you're going to the Estonian community, for example, and trying to raise money for your long-term care home, it's hard to raise the money when you say, oh, and incidentally, 20% of the people who are living there are Russian. That might be a bit tricky, eh?
Yeah. I mean, that to put it mildly, might shut us down. And see, and this is the other sort of problem that we're getting into is that we're now down below 60% in terms of Estonians that we're serving in long-term care. Does that mean that we don't have Estonians that we could help? Not at all. We have a waiting line.
Yeah.
Our home is a dual home, so we have nursing beds and we also have retirement rooms. I would tell you, without trying to breach anybody's personal history, that we have a lot of people that we have on our lower floors in our retirement rooms that we would love to have and be able to care for in long-term care beds. But because they're not coming from hospitals and they're not labeled a crisis case, we can't even move them upstairs.
Okay, I'm going back to Samir Sinha now. Give us some numbers on, because you would know as well as anybody, and I know this is a terrible expression, but they call them bed blockers, right? These are people who have complicated situations, but they're in hospitals, they're taking up acute care beds. It's not the best place for them to be. They should be in long-term care. How bad is that problem that has obviously prompted the Ontario government to say, we got to get them out of there, and even into culturally inappropriate settings if need be?
Yeah. So when I was tasked with developing the senior strategy over a decade ago now, we really talked about the fact that if we're going to care well for our aging population, we need to have a good continuum of care and the right mix of services so you can provide the right care in the right place at the right time. And part of the reason why we have 15% of our acute hospital beds occupied by people who can't even go home, can't go to a rehab, can't go to a long-term care home, is we haven't right-sized our system. So we have, part of the issue is if we first of all just had more home and community care, people wouldn't even have to think about being placed anywhere else. People could actually leave the hospital and go home. But now we have this problem that we've created by just underfunding key parts of the system. And now the government decides, well, just move people through faster. So let's just pass legislation saying even if you don't want to go to that home that has a bed available, you're going. And the challenge is that they put this legislation in, it violates people's charter rights for consent. You can share their information to who wants this person. And it hasn't actually solved the problem. In fact, things have only gotten worse, Stephen. The ALC numbers in Ontario after
alternative
level of care, what we designate these individuals in hospitals, has actually worsened by 13% year over year for that general group. And those specifically waiting for a long-term care bed in hospital has actually worsened by 34%. And partly it's because we're not providing enough home community care. We've been focused on sending billions, building all these new beds, frankly, to warehouse a lot of people who don't need to be treated that way, instead of actually properly investing in the care where people want as well to get care in their own homes.
Should we, we don't have anybody from the Ministry of Long-Term Care here, but they did send us a statement. You want to put this up now, Sheldon? I'm at the bottom of the page. This is Daniel Strauss, spokesperson to the Minister for Long-Term Care, who says the following: we understand the importance of cultural care homes to Ontarians and the challenges they are currently facing. However, a hospital is not a home, and it is important that seniors receive care where it most suits their specific needs. This is why Ontario prioritizes the medical care needs of residents when helping seniors find a home in long-term care. The government will continue to work with the long-term care industry and specific homes to find solutions that work for all Ontarians while we continue to end hallway healthcare in Ontario and build Ontario's long-term care capacity. Okay, that's a big exhale from you there. What's the problem?
I'm focusing on the medical care. Yes, that's one thing. But if we're not looking at the residents' holistic needs, they stop eating. They go back to hospital. They don't feel included, so their well-being actually deteriorates. We've, Stephen has mentioned about the research about, general quality of life. If you have that cultural attentiveness, the ability to feel at home and communicate within your.
But let's even, go further. It's not just about quality of life. If the ministry wants to argue this on the basis of medical care, we have lots of medical research saying that culturally safe and appropriate care, language concordant care means you're able to express yourself more easily, be understood, and have your medical issues better dealt with. We see this in acute care hospitals. We see this in every other part of the system. We're now actually violating this and actually making it worse. And that's why we're actually seeing worse outcomes clinically. But frankly, what really appalls me about this legislation is just like moving through. That we're treating these individuals like cattle. We're saying their medical needs take priority. If we're saying their medical needs do take priority, frankly, we'd actually take into the cultural context as well.
But, okay, Stephen, I don't know if this is the case, but the government, in its wisdom, has decided that the situation in hospitals is so urgent at the moment, they've got to clear those beds out, and damn it, if it means sending people into culturally inappropriate settings, so be it.
Well, it's interesting, the statement that came from the minister's staff. Arguably, moving someone between 70 to 150 kilometers away from their community which is allowed, which happens under Bill 7 by force. And has happened to over 400 individuals since this legislation's gone into play, is not good care. Alexandra brought up an interesting comment as well, which is not everyone needs high levels of clinical care when they come into long-term care. They're looking for a social network. And when you have a community that surrounds an individual geographically, but also socially, culturally, and you ask those individuals to give of their time, their talent, their treasure. You ask them to donate to the organization, to give of themselves as volunteers, to be linked to those individuals. But then you dilute or change the mix in that home making that much more challenging for individuals.
No, I get it, but is it working? Is it clearing the backlog in hospitals?
No. Absolutely not.
Still isn't anyway.
No,
It's 34% worse.
It's worse based on the data, but more importantly than that, very practically speaking, at the front line, our wait lists have not decreased. And the individuals on our wait lists, because we can see who those individuals are who've named us as a home or an organization they want to come to, we can see those in the community and those who are in hospital that are linked to our community drifting down the crisis wait list as other people move in front. And you don't get to pick and choose.
I'm reminded of a panel you had about a year ago talking about why Ontario can't build big projects anymore.
Oh, yeah.
And I think part of the, or one of the panelists had talked about politics over policy. And we're at that, we're really a victim of that right now.
Yeah, we're there.
And I mean, I understand Bill 7 and what it's trying to get done, and obviously it's not working. But some of these problems that we have today were issues that were basically in the viewfinder 15, 20 years ago.
Yes.
We knew where our demographics were going, and nobody answered the call.
Correct.
Well,
Right?
let me ask you, you've had good relationships with political leaders in the past. Have you met with the new Minister of Long-Term Care yet?
Not the latest one, our fifth since this ministry was recreated.
This is Natalie Kuzendova right now.
Yes, I think she's our fifth minister
Natalia.
since 2019.
Now, it's interesting because she's herself, I believe, an immigrant and you would think, understand the experience of culturally appropriate settings. But you haven't met her. Have you tried to meet her?
I haven't.
Okay. Has anybody here tried to get a meeting?
I've met with her multiple times.
You have?
Yes.
And?
And I believe that she understands the cultural needs of our community. She is Polish. She has Polish roots, does attend a lot of our Polish cultural events and advocacy efforts for our community. So I think she herself understands, but I believe she also has ministry pressures in terms of managing the entire sector versus just the cultural one. So I understand there could be some challenges, but she herself has been a large advocate.
And I mean, from the advantage side of the equation, as an association, we've absolutely met with her when she was the parliamentary assistant, and we'll be having a meeting with her this week, actually, as well. And cultural homes is on the agenda for the conversation. But one of the challenges I think she faces is that she is but a person in a very large machine. And with a background in nursing and having worked the floors during the pandemic, she has seen firsthand how homes can function and how homes can fall into dysfunction. But and I know she's committed. It's just a matter of us now getting that commitment to translate into some action.
I do want to make one comment.
Please.
She visited my home on Friday for a
Copernicus.
tour, Copernicus Lodge, and she was able to speak in her native tongue to the residents that had advanced dementia.
Which
and
I bet they appreciated.
And the smiles on their face of being heard and understood by somebody from the ministry. That spoke volumes. We have videos posted on our social network. I advise you to take a look. But you definitely see the impact of the residents when they see an individual that they could communicate
But
with.
another thing that we've discussed in our group, and I think we had aside from the politicians, are the people in the ministry themselves. So we had I remember this call we had. I think we all came off of it pretty peeved off. But, I'm not being diplomatic, sorry. The problem was that, we were talking about cultural appropriate care, and one of the people from the ministry said, well, wait a second now, if I'm not of ethnicity, or if I don't, follow this religion or this spirituality, then you're not going to admit me, or you don't want to admit me. And he said, no, that's not the issue. What we're trying to say is you can take that person who needs that kind of care or who follows that kind of dietary need and put them in a more appropriate home. Just don't send them to me. My mother-in-law is Chinese. I'm not going to have her sit in the Estonian home. Nobody's going to play mahjong with her. It doesn't make sense.
It's a bad fit.
Right.
That's a bad fit. That's our time, everybody. I really want to thank the four of you for coming in tonight and helping us understand this situation a lot better. It's a very timely conversation, and best of luck going forward. Stephen Harrison and Alexandra Gujeshchuk on the right-hand side of the table, Almayusi Samir Sinha on the left-hand side of the table. Dziękuję bardzo.
Dziękuję.
Tomorrow at 9 p.m., join us for a new episode of TVO Today Live.
I will tell you that Canada is not a superpower in terms of military or economic. But I think Canada is a superpower in terms of democratic values.
That's Thursday, right after the agenda. If you're a movie history buff, you'll recognize the names Mack Sennett and Hal Roach as being among the greatest of the Hollywood producer-director pioneers from a century ago. Mark Kearney has just written a book suggesting we ought to put a third name on that list, Al Christie. And so we've come to the Grand Theatre in London, Ontario to find out why. Mark, great to meet you.
Good to meet you, Steve.
First question is, what are we doing here in the Grand Theatre in London, Ontario?
Well, we're here because the subject of my book, Al Christie, started his show business career here. He was a stagehand at the Grand Theatre.
What year?
Well, the theater, this version of the theater was built in 1901. He might have actually worked at the older one, which burned down a year before that. So we're talking early 1900s for sure.
Your book is called Hollywood's Forgotten Film Pioneer, Al Christie. How did you come upon his story in the first place?
Well, you know, it was almost like a random thing. I was browsing the shelves of one of the libraries at Western University, where I teach, and I was looking through a bunch of books about Hollywood film history, and I came across a guy by the name of John S. Robertson, who was a silent film director from London, Ontario. And I'd never heard of this guy, and I thought, well, that's interesting. I should look him up and do some more research on him. Looking him up led me to Al Christie, who also is from London, Ontario. And Christie seemed to have more written about him than Robertson, so I just sort of shifted the focus from him to Christie.
Well, in fact, I guess about 100 years ago, when they talked about the big producer-directors in Hollywood at the time, there was Mack Sennett, there was Hal Roach, and there was Al Christie. Now, the first two guys, among film buffs, are pretty well remembered. How come not your guy?
That's a good question, and I still ask myself that question. Christie was as popular as they were. His films were as popular as they were in the sort of 1920s. Sennett especially made slapstick films. He was the pie in the face, the Keystone Cops, car chases, etc. Christie was more of a situational comedy director. His movies, his short movies tended to have more plot. They had stories. There was some slapstick, but not too much. And I think that in some ways, slapstick lives on. You can still have slapstick today and people laugh at it. If you have a situation comedy from more than 100 years ago, some of the things are relatable, but not everything. So I think that's one thing. I've been told by silent film historians that Sennett was a great self-promoter, probably the best in the business at the time. So that might be a reason. The other thing is that Sennett worked with Charlie Chaplin, Mabel Normand, Fatty Arbuckle, people that sort of went on to become really, really famous in the silent film era. Hal Roach worked with Laurel and Hardy. They had big names attached to them. Christie, his comedians, his actors, for whatever reason, were popular at the time but didn't really live on.
What do you mean? Harrison Ford was one of them.
Harrison Ford, there is an actor by the name of Harrison Ford.
Maybe not the one we know today.
Not the one we know today, yeah.
But there was Harold Lloyd back then, there was Buster Keaton back then. The names that you mentioned, did Christie get to work with any of them?
Christie worked with Keaton in the 30s. When they started making sound films, Christie had used Keaton in a couple of films. Keaton's career at that point was sort of on the downslide. And so I think Keaton was happy to get any kind of work he was going to get. And Christie was, at that point, had moved to New York and was making short comedy films there. And he did a couple with Keaton.
I wonder if that's another reason why Christie's name is not as big as those other guys, is that those other guys tended to make feature movies and Christie's movies were shorter.
Yeah.
Did that matter?
I think it did, because feature films sort of took over in the 1920s. And Christie was a real believer in the short films. And his interviews, his promotional materials, whenever he had the chance, he would talk about, it's the short films that people come to see. That's why they're really here in the theater. They don't really want to see the long features. And so he kept making them. He did make his own features. They did do well, some of them. But he was definitely a believer in the short film. And the other ones that you mentioned, people like Lloyd and Keaton and Chaplin also starred in their movies, right? So they're not only directors, they're actors. Whereas as Christie, he's just the producer-director. He's not on camera.
Did I read this right in your book, that he set up, Al Christie, the first ever Hollywood studio at Sunset and Gower?
Sunset and Gower. So this is the reason, one of the main reasons I wrote about Christie. He's the first director-producer in Hollywood ever. He goes out with his company in 1911. They show up, they don't know anything about Hollywood, but there's a tavern there. that's for rent, and he thinks this is a great place. It's at Sunset and Gower, and the next day they're shooting movies. So I always like to say that all of Hollywood movie history begins with Al Christie. Every Canadian that's ever gone to Hollywood has a direct line to Al Christie. He's the first guy there. He makes films there for about a year. They merge with Universal Pictures, which is still around today. He works for them for about 3 or 4 years, and then he goes back to the Sunset and Gower site and sets up his own studio in 1916.
And what was it called?
Christie Comedies, Christie Studios.
Is there anything there today to acknowledge that history?
There is not. There used to be. I was there about 20 years ago, and the building that was there on that site was the CBS headquarters. And they had a plaque out front saying, this is the site where Al Christie, blah, 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 set up his studio on this site. CBS Studios since moved away from that, that corner. And I was there about 3 years ago doing research for the book, and I went to look for the plaque. It's not there. I think it's in there. Wherever they moved, they took the plaque with them.
Also fair to say he made the first ever Hollywood comedy movie?
Yes, absolutely. He would have been the producer on the very first Hollywood movie, which would have been a drama probably. But yes, the very first comedy film would have been his.
He has a star on the Walk of Fame in Hollywood, California.
He does. He's had one since 1960. He died in 1951. So his star has been there quite a long time. And I have gone out of my way to let the people at Canada's Walk of Fame know that, hey, isn't it interesting that this guy who's Canadian has a star on the Walk of Fame in Hollywood, but we don't have one for him in Toronto. So I've written to them and I suggested that he get one.
Anything in London, Ontario, his hometown?
Not that I'm aware of. And I think there's something that, again, they could have a plaque or something, maybe here at the Grand, in front of the Grand, because he worked here, just to acknowledge that, you know, here's the guy who basically started the Hollywood film industry, and he's from London.
Well, you can't see it here, but apparently backstage, he's got his name on the wall here.
Apparently, yes, which is something somebody told me before, and I thought, really, that's interesting. And so, yes, he's got his name in big letters. I don't know how it got there. I'm not sure anybody knows how it got there, but it's great that they're acknowledging that he has some connection to the Grand.
Okay, so Mark, take us back. How did this guy get into the movie business to begin with?
So he grew up not too far from here, a few blocks from where the Grand Theater is. He probably would have been a teenager. He was interested in comedy actors, vaudeville acts. So anybody coming through on the vaudeville circuit would have come through London, done their show, and moved on to the next city. He, for some reason, felt that he could help their comedy. He would watch their act, and I don't know if he took notes or whatever, but he would find a way to go and talk to these people and say, you know what, I've got an idea for your show. You should try it out. And some of them did, and apparently got laughs. So apparently got this reputation. There's this young kid in London, Ontario. If you want help with your show, go see him and he'll see what he can do. He wasn't doing that full time. And I don't think he was working at the Grand full time, but he did work as a stagehand here. He probably would have been in his early 20s or late teens, early 20s. And he was apparently had a knack for comedy and was not shy about making suggestions.
And when he finally got his movie studio up and going, how many movies a year did he make?
Well, he made more than 1,000 films in his career, which is about a 30-year career. So he was making, probably in the early days, as many as 50 a year. Got it, and then 30, maybe 25 a year. These, again, were mostly short films, 10 minutes, 22 minutes, something like that. But still, even for the silent film area, 1,000 films in a career is just, to me, is mind-blowing.
Incredibly prolific.
Yeah, absolutely.
Are they viewable today anywhere?
Some are. There's some on YouTube. Not a lot, but I've seen some. Some of the silent ones, some of the talking ones that he made. There's a museum outside of San Francisco called the Niles Silent Film Museum. They have about 30 or so of his films there, and they did a retrospective on him about 3 years ago. There's some in the Library of Congress in the US. There are a lot of private collectors, apparently, that would have some. Eastman House in Rochester, New York has some of his films. And I'm told, I don't really know the extent of it, there are various archives, probably in Eastern Europe, that have some of his films. Czech Republic, Poland, for some reason.
Why?
I don't know. I mean, his films were shown all over the world, because silent films were kind of a universal language. He went to Europe a lot to promote his films when he was running his studio. For whatever reason, he had popularity in Europe as well.
Frank Capra is a name that many of our viewers and listeners will know, became a legend in Hollywood, and they worked together. What was that experience like?
Yeah, so Capra, this is a very typical Christie thing, which is people on their way up or on their way down, he worked with. So Frank Capra came to work at Christie Studios when Capra was a nobody. He was a would-be screenwriter. He wrote about it a little bit in his autobiography about he would just do any job he could with the Christies. He tried to write some scenes, hoped that they would let him direct. I don't think he ever got a chance, but he was probably there for about a year or so learning the film business. And then off he went to work with other studios, and then of course he became one of the most important directors in Hollywood in the 30s and 40s.
He was always experiencing financial troubles. How come?
Making movies in Hollywood in the 1910s and 20s was not an easy business. There were a lot of little studios. There were bigger ones that were getting bigger, who had distribution deals set up, etc. And Christie, you know, he went on his own, and so he had to do all his distribution deals himself as well. He didn't have a lot of money, but he had loyal actors, and he seemed to have popular films, so he was generating income. But in the late teens, there was, you know, World War I was going on, so that was hurting attendance. Spanish flu came in, that really hurt attendance at movie theaters. So he, like others, had to struggle. Around 1920 or so, he got a distribution deal with a company called Educational Pictures, which was based in New York. And that pretty much saved the studio. They had a good deal. Educational had a really wide network. And so in the 20s, the Christies actually thrived, and they made a lot of money. And there was a story, I think, in the local London Free Press at the time that noted that, you know, Al Christie has just become a millionaire or something like that, which was like, ooh, a big deal. So he and his brother Charles, who handled the money outside of the business, they did very well in the 20s. And then, of course, the Depression came along, and that hurt them.
Christie seemed to like making movies about people in curious or odd, but always funny circumstances. And there was a movie you sent me, I guess, what is it, 15, 16 minutes long, something like that? It's called Know Thy Wife. Do you want to just give us the plot of that?
Yeah, so Know Thy Wife is from 1918. It's a short comedy. It's a very typical Christie film. It's a story about a guy in college and his wife, who is also in college, and they are secretly married. And his family back home wants him to come home and marry the girl next door. And so he doesn't know what to do. So
and the parents don't know that he's already
married.
married.
No idea that he's married. So instead of just telling them they're married, he and his real roommate decide that the wife is going to dress up like a guy and be Steve the roommate from college. So they go back to meet the parents under this pretense. And of course, the parents put them up in the same bedroom because it's just, and they're college roommates, etc. And so that's how the plot goes from there, is this idea of when do we reveal that in fact they actually are married? Sorry, girl next door, you're not the one that he's going to marry.
And Steve is actually a woman.
Steve is a woman. And so this is a very common thing in Christie movies. His actors and actresses, the actresses will dress up as men, pretend to be men as part of the plot. The actors will dress up as women as part of the plot, as a way to sort of advance the story, some kind of mistaken identity, etc. The other thing that's, I think, also interesting, and particularly in Know That Wife, is that the woman, Dorothy DeVore, is the actress, she's in college, and that's probably a pretty unusual thing from that era. And he has several films where women are either in college or they're working. They're doing some kind of thing. They're not just a housewife. And that's very typical, again, of Christie.
Well, I'm guessing there'd be something else in that movie that you wouldn't have seen every day if you went to the movies 100 years ago. And that is, of course, with the mistaken identity happening, the husband and wife are sneaking in a kiss, of course, behind the scenes, and the mom walks in and catches what she thinks are two guys kissing.
Right, exactly.
And what does it say in this?
And she said, the title says, you boys sure like each other, or something like that, right? This is a really interesting thing from 100 and whatever years ago, right? And that, I think, is an interesting plot point, because we get, at least for a modern day audience, that's a pretty good laugh. How did audiences, were they shocked back then? Or they just know, oh, well, of course, we're in on the joke. Mm-hmm. We know that she's a female, not a guy, but interesting that they would have a scene like that, for sure.
He did have a lot of adversity in his life, personally as well. His first marriage breaks up.
Yep.
His 10-year-old daughter is killed. Tell that story. What happened there?
His 10-year-old daughter, Lenora, who they called Shirley, was in a riding accident, a horse riding accident in 1922. Apparently, she was riding with somebody. She turned to talk to somebody, or something happened, and she was thrown from the horse. She didn't die immediately, but she died probably within a day, and she was only 10 years old. The thing that I could not find anything about is what was his reaction to this. What was his life like after that? There were stories in the papers in Los Angeles about it, so he was well known enough. From what I gather, he didn't stop working. He was churning out films in that time frame. I think she died in the summer, and that summer he was making as many films as he always did. One of his actresses told a silent film historian many years later that Al was never the same after that. But that's about as far as I got with it. She's buried in the same cemetery as he is in Hollywood. He did remarry a few years later, and that's really all we know about Shirley and her death.
He had a quite amazing house, Waverly. Tell us what that looked like.
Yeah, the Waverly Mansion is in Beverly Hills, and he and his brother Charles built that in the mid-1920s. So again, they're doing very well. And it's a big Tudor-style house, which is unusual for Beverly Hills at that time. 5-car garage, nobody had a 5-car garage back then, and 3 wings. So he lived there in one wing, his brother Charles lived in the other, and their mother Mary, who had moved out to Hollywood, and their half-sister Anne lived in the other wing. It was called the Waverly. As far as I know, the reason was that Charles Christie was married to a woman named Edna Durand from here, from the London area. Edna Durand's father George Durand, was a famous architect in this area, and he built a house here in London in the 19th century called the Waverly Mansion for one of the rich families here. So it's my guess is that this is sort of Charles's nod to his father-in-law, that they call the mansion in Beverly Hills the Waverly.
I see in the book, you say Cole Porter wrote Night and Day in that home.
Apparently Cole Porter wrote the song Night and Day in the Waverly Mansion probably around 1930. He must have been just visiting there or a guest or whatever. The Christies, as I said, went bankrupt in the Depression a few years later. They sold the house. The house was sold several times over the years. Debbie Reynolds, the actress, got married there, one of her marriages, in 1960. And the latest purchase of that house was in the early 1990s by Phil Collins, the rock star, and his then wife, Jill. And Jill still lives in the house.
She does.
She does. And I got to go visit with Jill. I did an interview with her, not in the house, but at the end of the interview, she said, you know what, I think you should come to the house tomorrow. And so the next day I pull up and they open the gates, and there's Jill, and she's walking around the grounds, and she's telling me about the Waverly, and there's an object that's on the outside of the house that's apparently depicts an architect, which makes me again think that this was a nod to Charles's father-in-law. And after about 15 or 20 minutes of that, she said, you know, I think we should go inside the house, but you can't take any pictures.
How cool was that for you?
It was very cool. It was very cool because if you're driving along where the house is, you can't see it from the street. There's too much vegetation and there's a big fence, etc. So I thought, wow, I'm so close. It would be so nice to get in and see the house. And then to get in and see the inside of the house was great as well.
That was very nice of her.
Very nice of her. She was very, very helpful.
Charlie's Aunt. That's one of his pictures, but that's a feature-length film, right? Which he didn't do many of, but was that his best one, do you think?
I think it's the one that critics tend to focus on when anybody says anything about Hal Christie, which isn't much until this book. They usually mention Charlie's Aunt as one of his more successful films. It's a feature-length film, stars Sid Chaplin, who is Charlie Chaplin's brother. Al Christie bought the rights. It was a stage play that had been around for about 20 or so years at least, very popular. He bought the film rights. He hired Chaplin to be the star of it. He didn't direct it, but he produced it, and as a producer, he probably would have had a lot of say on just how the film turned out. I'm told by one film historian that every year in Hollywood in those days, the film distributors would have a list of what they thought were the best, most successful films at their theaters across North America. And Charlie's Aunt would have been in the top 3. And it was the same year that Charlie Chaplin made The Gold Rush, and The Gold Rush was behind Charlie's Aunt.
How about that?
So how about that? I mean, that's a pretty successful film.
Now, 1929, The Jazz Singer comes out, the first talkie ever with Al Jolson. How did that change Al Christie's business?
So when they made The Jazz Singer, 1927.
27, sorry.
The Jazz Singer. There had been a few talking films beforehand, but this was one that really popularized talking films. And I think a lot of people who might know anything about Hollywood history know that that's really a marking point. That silent films and then there's sound films. It didn't happen overnight because a lot of the theaters weren't even wired for sound to show it. And so a lot of movie makers, including Christie, would have made silent and sound versions for the next couple of years till about 1929. Christie embraced it. He was on talking films right away. I don't know really why, except that he just thought this was an excellent idea. He started making sound films almost right away. He and his brother Charles bought a studio, the Metropolitan Studios in the Hollywood area, and leased it out to other filmmakers, including Harold Lloyd, to make sound pictures there. And so that was it. Christie switched over to sound pictures and made nothing but sound pictures after that.
There's a movie that he did called The Birth of a Baby,
Yes.
which, as the title suggests, has the birth of a baby in the movie. Was that controversial in the time?
Absolutely controversial, and it's interesting. I've never seen it, but my understanding is they found some woman who was willing to be filmed. It's a kind of a documentary of her giving birth to a baby. And there was a lot of outrage about this. There were various states that banned it. Eleanor Roosevelt, who was well known at the time, obviously, she came out in favor of it and said, we must show this film. This is absolutely necessary so that people know how babies are born or whatever. Al Christie didn't seem to catch much of the controversy. It was more about the film itself. It did quite well. Obviously, the fact that it was banned probably helped business, as it often does. Years later, about 1947, I think it was reissued. And millions of people saw it, and according to at least one story in the Los Angeles Times, there were people keeling over, fainting when they saw this, probably mostly guys who just never knew what to do. And so it was a very popular film.
When he died in 1951, did the media make much of a fuss about it?
It got a fair amount of attention. He was a well-known guy in Hollywood. He hadn't been making movies then for about 10 years at that point. But from what I could see of the various news clips, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, any of the big newspapers made mention of him, sort of Hollywood pioneer dies. Some of them had his age wrong. Some of them had his work when he started in Hollywood wrong. But nevertheless, he did get a lot of coverage, and it was obviously somebody who had touched a lot of people by the time he did die.
Having spent so much time now trying to tell his story, do you think he does belong up there on the pantheon with Max Sennett and Hal Roach?
I absolutely do. It's not to say, oh, I've written about Al Christie, therefore he's the best, whatever. No, I just think that he and Sennett and Roach were considered at the time in the 20s, sort of that group of three silent film directors who were kind of a notch below Chaplin and Keaton, etc. They all did short films and long films. Both Sennett and Roach eventually got honorary Oscars. Christie died too soon and didn't get his. I think he should have, based on his career. And I think that if you watch his films, if you can watch some of his films, and you watch Roach films and you watch Sennett films, I think you're going to have good films and you're going to have some films that aren't so good, but that's just the way the movie business is.
Have you figured out why the lack of prominence for him over the years bothered you so much that you decided you needed to write a book about it?
As a journalist, you're always looking for good stories. And to me, this was a story of, when I came across it, this is the first guy that ever made a movie in Hollywood. I thought, well, that alone seems enough to sort of just write something about. And then, oh, but by the way, he had a 30-year career in movies. He made 1,000 films. Some of them were very critically acclaimed, et cetera, et cetera. Why is this story not being told? And of course, being here in London, being Canadian, again, it's just like, this story needs to be told because he's a very prominent part of Hollywood history and was acknowledged as much. In the late 20s, there were several stories of him looking back when they first came to Hollywood and reminiscing. So he was known as a sort of Hollywood pioneer. Why hasn't there been a book about this guy? I thought, well, if there's a book to be written, then I should do it because I'm here and I'm in London and I'm interested in silent movies and I'm a writer. And so it was just everything coming together, and I hope that this will help sort of right the wrong of him being overlooked.
Well, I'm a big movie fan, and I can tell you, I was very happy. I knew nothing about him and was very happy to know about him, having now read the book. So great job.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate that.
Now, I got one last kind of odd question.
Okay.
What is it like to have the name Mark Kearney at this day and age in our country's history?
Well, nobody's ever mistook me for the other Mark Kearney, who spells his name differently. He's C-A-R-N-E-Y. But you get the odd joke about, oh yeah, I saw you on the TV last night. It's not me. It's not me.
Do you plan to run for the Liberal leadership?
I don't have any plans at this moment, Steve.
At this moment?
I have no plans.
So it's a possibility?
No, it's not.
You're not shutting the door?
I am shutting the door. I will not do that.
Okay. Well, we could channel the spirit of Al Christie to come shoot it, if you like.
Yes.
If and when you make the announcement.
That would be great. But we'll make it silent so that nobody can hear what I'm saying.
Very good. Mark, this was a pleasure. Thanks for doing it.
Thank you, Steve.
Finally tonight, we held a special ceremony in this studio yesterday in honor of one of TVO's greatest leaders. Peter Herndorf was the chair and CEO of TVO from 1992 to 99. We introduced a lot of new shows on Peter's watch, including the nightly current affairs offering Studio 2, a weekly Queen's Park show called Fourth Reading, and the weekly foreign affairs program Diplomatic Immunity. He took a chance and hired a relatively unknown 32-year-old host, and I hope he felt vindicated by that decision. That host was me. Peter loved nothing more than hanging out in the control room, watching our shows go to air, never interfering, but being wonderfully supportive. And so the control room, where Sheldon and company handle the technical side of the agenda, will henceforth be known as Peter A. Herndorf Control Room. The only thing missing from yesterday's event was Peter himself. He died 16 months ago at age 82. Tomorrow on the agenda.
It's not a glamorous thing for people to be hammering steel, so I just think it's slowly kind of fading out. Even in Japan, you're seeing lesser and lesser smiths for sure.
That's tomorrow on the agenda.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.